Mr. Bolt, we appreciate you taking some time for us here. There have been 3 audits of corrections in 2022 alone. All say Indigenous inmates have worse outcomes than other offenders. They're released later in their sentence, overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institutions, overrepresented in structured intervention units. Can you tell us why that is?
The challenge of Indigenous offenders is very much a systemic challenge. Definitely within the overall justice system, Correctional Service of Canada has a job to do. We continue to struggle. I mean, we continue to see our admission rates for Indigenous offenders continue to at least remain steady, if not go up a bit up on the rise in the last number of years. We've been seeing an increase in the overall population in 10 years in terms of for what we call the flow in terms of federal corrections. And you know, when we look at sort of the risk and need level of Indigenous offenders, it continues to be a challenging group of individuals. There have been significant improvements made since the reports. We've introduced what we call our Indigenous Intervention Centers, which is a streamlined case management approach to providing better intake and programs and release planning. We've received some additional monies through Budget 2017 to provide better support to communities, but it continues to be an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the correctional investigator says in the last decade there have been very little change in outcome for Indigenous offenders. All the issues that I just mentioned still exist. So, I mean, can you say there's been much change?
I mean, we are seeing an incremental change, in particular in our release rates. We've seen an increase in the last 5 years in our day parole and full parole rates. I think last I checked it was about a 23% increase over the last 5 years. We're also seeing better outcomes, I should say, in terms of returns to custody, especially after 5 years once released. But again, the challenge continues to be the admission rates and the overall numbers as well. We've revamped, I would say, as part of our National Indigenous Plan, our overall case management process, our programming interventions, and as I said, you know, we've provided some money, some additional monies to support communities' involvement with release planning as well.
According to the correctional investigator, Indigenous women make up 65% of female inmates and are classified as maximum security offenders. The Auditor General says it's the way you classify them when they enter the prison system. How are you changing that system?
So our classification system is a fairly complex process. We do use an actuarial tool, which I'm sure, as you read about in some of our responses, is currently being reviewed by academia in terms of whether or not there are systemic challenges with regard to it. It has been validated over years, but we did take the recommendation from the OAG and from the OCI about having it reviewed. The other piece that's a part of our classification and review process at intake is consideration of an individual's Indigenous social history and expectations of reviewing that social history to develop a solid plan to address their risk and need and to support their reintegration. That has been a process that's been in place for quite some time and has gone through much sort of training and development over the number of years. We also, through Bill C-83 a number of years ago, introduced it into our legislation that consideration was a legal requirement for the organization. So again, you know, the issue around classification is a challenging one. It also is very much dependent on the criminal offense cycle and the risk and need of the individual. For many of our Indigenous women, unfortunately, we have seen a change in that profile as well over the last few years.
Offenders that are released on statutory release have a harder time readjusting, according to the correctional investigator and the Auditor General. What is Corrections doing to ensure that Indigenous offenders are released earlier in their sentence like other inmates?
Again, we've seen a significant increase in that. As I said, that 23% increase over the last 5 years, and that's really about a day parole, full parole increase. So really the expectations is to ensure that they have access to the interventions and programming and supports that they need to address their risks while they're incarcerated, and then also to ensure that we have, I'll call it that safety net in the community to actually be able to support them as well. For many of these individuals, I mean, offenders in general, but in particular for Indigenous offenders, there's been a real breakdown in their connections and good connections to communities, that the reestablishment of those connections is challenging. So we've done a lot of work, and we're doing more every day to develop more partnerships, to enhance those community relationships, to provide better support in the community.
Like you say, lots of challenges here. Ivan Zinger did congratulate corrections, saying that you're putting more resources to community corrections. Can you tell us what you're doing there?
Well, I mean, in general, we've seen a shift in our population in the last 10 years, which is good news, that we're actually seeing a significant increase in our numbers of offenders being supervised in the community. That includes for Indigenous offenders. One of the things that I can speak about from an Indigenous perspective, as I said, in Budget 2017, we received approximately $6.5 million that we invest on an annual basis to support that transition, for lack of a better word. Some of it has to do with, and we did increase some of our staff resources, so we have Indigenous community liaison officers and development officers who are there to sort of develop those partnerships and relationships with communities. But we also have funding that's directly directed at community support. So some of it could be working with communities to establish better relationships, to plan what we call our Section 84 release plans, which is basically a Indigenous community-centered release plan. The other piece is we just introduced in the last year or so a contribution program that will allow for some innovative projects working with Indigenous communities to better engage on things like, trauma, counseling, addiction support, and gang affiliation.
Mr. Maltby, we'll have to leave it there, but certainly appreciate you spending some time with us here to talk about this.
Thank you very much.